looking into the future, technology to the rescue. We are talking about artificial intelligence and how it might be used for good, especially in the world of journalism. Let's have a closer look.
Disruptive developments, calling for radical innovations. Digitization has sparked dynamic shifts that are changing our everyday lives. Do you want to understand how and why? Let's get to it.
Do you speak science? Maybe a little too well, because what use is knowledge if no one understands it? Sometimes simple communication can be quite difficult. Looking into the future, Part 2.
Technology to the rescue, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about how AI can be used for good, especially in the world of journalism. How can it potentially help to deliver high-quality reporting, free up creativity, and ultimately re-establish trust? We have a very, very distinguished panel for you. Joining us is Professor Charlie Beckett, founding director of Panelists, the journalism think tank at LSE. He's joining us from London. Welcome to you, Charlie. Mona Sloane, meantime, is joining us from New York. Mona is a sociologist there working on inequality in the context of AI design and policy. She's at NYU. And Ling is joining us from Shanghai, where he's a scholar and an entrepreneur bridging machine intelligence and creativity. His company, Tenzine.com, it sells solutions to big brands like Unilever and Alibaba. Welcome to all of you. Thank you so much for joining us here at the Global Media Forum. And Professor Beckett, I'd like to begin with you and ask you, because before you joined LSE, you spent decades working as a journalist, so you've really had a front row seat to developments and changes in the industry. And this conversation has the title, Technology to the Rescue. So I'm just wondering, do you think journalism needs rescuing right now? And if so, where does AI fit into the mix?
Well, as you say, I worked as a journalist for a long time, so I'm very sympathetic to the mission of journalism. And I think in this pandemic year, we can see how important it is that we do have professionals who give us information that's reliable and relevant, and so important for us to live our lives in a healthy way. And technology, it won't save journalism. I mean, journalism has to save itself. It has to show its worth to people so they appreciate it and they support it and they pay for it. I think in this last year, we've seen how journalism is actually very resilient, I think it's done a really good job, or it's tried to, around the world at a time when there's so much misinformation and there's this kind of confusing abundance of information out there. And technology can definitely help. We've seen how it's definitely transformed our information environment and how it's transformed journalism. I spent the last 15 years studying how the internet and digital technologies have changed journalism. And of course, there are negative sides to that, but there are also quite inspiring sides to the way that the internet allows journalists to reach people, to do research. And we've seen this wave of, first of all, there was going online. So we are now used to the idea that news organizations are on the internet, on the World Wide Web. Then there was that second phase in the last 10, 15 years of social media, so that we now have journalism on all those networks and platforms where we do all our other stuff, from email to socializing. And the latest phase is this sort of bundle of technologies which we kind of label so-called artificial intelligence, machine learning, automation, that kind of thing. And that's the latest transformational wave. And again, there are negative aspects, and a colleague in New York will perhaps talk about some of the ethical dangers around the algorithms.
We're going to dig down into all of those, in fact. Charlie, I know you're going to tell us some examples also a little bit later in our conversation. But first, I want to get to Mona. And as Charlie mentioned, Mona, I mean, you're taking a really big picture approach to looking at this. So tell us, as a sociologist, when you're looking at it from the perspective of ethics, equitability, policy, you've talked about the importance of defining success when it comes to AI. So tell us, why is that so important? And what are the questions that newsrooms, that journalists should be asking themselves right now when they're thinking about AI in the context of our profession?
Thank you so much, Sarah, for that question. So I think what's helpful is to kind of try to define AI a little bit before I answer that question. So without wanting to crudely simplify AI, I think it's fair to say that what we mean by AI, especially neural AI, are essentially technical systems that analyze data in order to make a prediction that serves as the basis for making a decision. For example, predicting what word in a sentence, what the next word in a sentence will be that you're typing on your phone or in an online document. And so based on that prediction, actually deciding what word will be suggested to you. This is a matter of calculating the probability of an event occurring. So really what we're dealing with here are statistical models or math. This has very little to do with the general artificial intelligence that we know from the Hollywood movies. For an AI model to work well, we need a definition of success because that's a key mechanism for the model to get optimized, to learn, to work better. Now, this is where it gets really interesting for me as a sociologist. The definition of success is a social process that is extremely revealing of who and what we value as a society and how we express that in and through technology. So for example, the definition of success of social media recommendation algorithms is, or at least used to be, more traffic, more profit from ad sales. It is not content that is fact-checked or content that is not hate speech, for example. So what that tells us that as a society, perhaps there was a little bit of a higher priority on economic growth over vetted information and by proxy healthy political processes. So when it comes to the big questions, and that's a big question you asked me, Sarah, what they should be asking about AI should always be who has the power and who tells the AI story and to what end? Who is not in that story? How does the tech work? Does the tech work? And journalists have done a fantastic job on that over the past years. A lot of real important research has actually come out of journalistic practice, and I really hope that we can integrate that more with research as we move forward.
I mean, it really says a lot about what we value as well, it sounds like. Ling, I'd like to turn to you now because I mentioned you're an entrepreneur, you're coming from the private sector, so you also have a different view on how AI is used and utilized. You're selling solutions to big companies. And so I'd like to ask you, perhaps we can continue along that line with what is valued and how success in AI is defined. What are these companies asking you for in terms of solutions? And what do you think that journalism could potentially learn from that?
Well, thank you, Sarah. I'm really not an expert in journalism. I'm more sort of introducing AI technology into the creative and content world. If we understand journalism as a large entity, also part of the creators world, then maybe what we offer to the what's sort of the solution that we offer might be make as a reference for journalism. What we do is really to introduce machine learning technology to the creative jobs. So instead of thinking AI as a way to automate everything, what we do is really to making AI as a learning loops that continuously can identify specific hyper effective strategies from let's say the brilliant outliers in content creation among us and distribute that best performing advice to the rest of the network. So that it would be very helpful for the business world to be more effective and to learning from the best practice and then emulate that in a very large scale. So that's sort of the things that what we do to help large enterprises.
So you're tracking results. I mean, you're really figuring out how, the content itself relates then to the bottom line. I mean, maybe that's something that we can ask Charlie about now, Professor Beckett, if he can tell us, how AI right now is being used in journalism, if there are similar techniques being used, for example. Just tell us a little bit more about how the technology is already providing solutions. And then a little bit later, we'll talk about what might be happening going forward.
Well, the thing about these technologies is that they're incredibly diverse. So I've literally got a list of hundreds of case studies on our Journalism AI website. And that's what's interesting about it, is that this set of technologies has a systemic effect on journalism. It can affect our news gathering, the way we do investigations, for example. It helps us to sort through huge data sets to try and get relevant information, or perhaps to uncover scandals. It helps us to make the content. We can automate a lot of the kind of routine journalism, like financial news or weather news. That can be automated quite easily. Or you can use it to help the reader, the user, if you like, to find the information that they want. So you can use the machine learning, for example, to personalize newsletters so that you get the information you want. So there's loads of different applications, but it's always there to augment or support the human journalists. There's a myth around that the robots are coming to replace the journalists. The evidence is that is not happening. These are a set of tools that we hope, at least, can help the journalists to do better human journalism.
But can I ask you, though, you mentioned this fear that's out there. So let's dig a little bit deeper into that, because you mentioned also financial journalism. Bloomberg, for example, has a bot that's called Cyborg, which is generating 1/3 of the content that comes out of that news organization. So, how can journalists really trust that this won't simply make them redundant in the end?
Well, Bloomberg is a great example, because that bot and a lot of the automation they do is to report on very, if you like, quite simple, factual, financial, economic statistics. And that kind of information lends itself very easily, or relatively easily, to automation. And I would rather a machine did it, if it can do it reliably and accurately, and leave the humans to do the more sophisticated work. And one of the tasks for those humans is going to be to edit the machines, to make sure that they don't get things wrong and that they're not biased or inaccurate. And that's a kind of new skill set, if you like, for journalists in the newsroom. But the evidence so far is that, generally speaking, the machines are at least as accurate as the human beings, and they're replacing basically quite boring jobs that human beings really shouldn't be doing in the first place.
Mona, I'd like to ask you, how do you see the human element when it comes to AI?
That's a big question, because I think really there is no non-human element in AI. All technology is social, and all technology, by the way, has an impact on the environment. I think that's a conversation we should be having more, especially as AI is very energy hungry. So when we say AI should be human-centered, we quickly find ourselves at a dead end. I think what we really need, instead of saying, well, we need the human in the loop, is kind of a new crop of technologists, journalists, decision makers, researchers, a public that has a particular literacy around how the social, the political, the economic, and the technological are actually intertwined, and think about the potential impacts that AI systems can have. We have new kind of processes that are developing in that space. We're increasingly talking about developing impact assessments for AI systems that are conducted prior to deployment, as well as new auditing technologies. And with new regulation kicking in, at least in the European Union, soon we will see that space growing even more.
Ling, I'm wondering what your perspective is on this, because in a conversation that you and I had before the panel, you said AI is basically like a coaching network. We need to not think of it as the enemy. Maybe you can give us an example of a way that you have been seeing it applied constructively in the line of work that you're doing.
Yeah, I really hope that we're not looking at machine can only do automation. Augmentation of human beings. That's why We always call AI as the coaching networks that help human do better at what they're doing. So if you think of automation, it's probably static input and static output. But if journalism or a lot of high-skilled professionals are actually dynamic input, like a lot of inputs and then digest and then to create. And so for the dynamic input, human would be helpful, a machine would be helpful for just a session of that. For instance, just like what Professor Beckett just mentioned, personalization of the stories. So maybe a journalist can write a story and then the machine can personalize that story into different versions for different viewers. What we see that already happened in the commercial world for commercial stories. I just wonder if that could also be a potential application for more serious news journalists.
Absolutely.
Journalism as well.
Absolutely. Professor Beckett, I'd like to ask you about that. Is it a positive or a negative to really have the ability through AI to understand users so much better that we can actually tailor the content, tailor the stories, tailor the subjects that we're reporting on? What are the ethics of that? Do you think, in the future that we might become a little bit too tailored toward niche audiences, perhaps lose some of the diversity in the reporting? What does it mean for society at large? I mean, there's so many questions about this. How are you looking at it at the Paula Center and just more broadly?
Well, as Mona said, this technology is not neutral. It's created by humans and it's used by humans. So in the same way that we make ethical or editorial or economic decisions about anything in our work as journalists, we can do the same with technology. We can use it to create clickbait. We can use it to create fake news. We can use it to create propaganda if that's what you want to do. But of course, you can also use it to try and create more reliable information that's relevant. And I don't particularly worry about over-personalization at the moment. I think if you talk to people in the real world, the number one problem they have is that there is this abundance of information and that they're confused and they're overwhelmed by it. So they want the journalists to make good judgments for them and use this technology to make it easier and more reliable for people to get the information that's relevant for them. So I don't particularly worry at the moment about this idea that we're all going to be in filter bubbles and little niches. Or I think that the real challenge at the moment is helping people, and as Mona said, to become more literate about this. All of us as journalists or as citizens, we're all grappling with this new information environment. So one of the tasks, I think, of journalists is to try and be transparent and to help people to understand the technology and how we're using it.
I mean, there are certainly those fundamentals in journalism, but we heard earlier in the day in the conversation looking into the future, part one, from the chairwoman of the Funka Media Group, for example, saying that journalism has really been behind as a general rule when it comes to adapting to the World Wide Web and technologies like AI, for example. And Ling, I'm just wondering what you think of the response that Professor Beckett had, because you're very much focused on the bottom line. I mean, you're helping companies measure what is effective on these content creation platforms, and then figuring out what makes money, what doesn't. And at the end of the day, a lot of news organizations, if they're not publicly funded, they do need to pay the bills. So Ling, tell us what you think of how journalism is approaching this right now.
Well, thank you very much for this question. I do agree with what Professor Beckett just mentioned, and also what Mona just said, the literacy part. Also, I totally agree. I think we're very lucky working in a purely business environment, but we do have the bottom line that we realize there's also potential backfire. As you know, I'm in China, and the Chinese government just also had a very strong data protection law published a few days ago, and all those things are become more and more aware even for business world. But I think one advantage is that with the big sort of business volume that we have, we got a lot of data input into our system. And then after we train the machine, actually we can make the technology more and more accessible to parts that's not purely commercial driven, but also social driven. So we are also start to open some of the technology to the non-for-profit world and social world. I think that's perhaps is a way out.
That's really interesting, Ling. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. Mona, I'd like to ask you, because you have said there's no unbiased algorithm. And we were talking a little bit about, curation and tailoring content. Sometimes there's also bias, we have to say, though, in the way that journalists are reporting, because of course we're all humans. Sometimes there's also bias in newsrooms, for example, racially or gender makeups, for example. How do you see the opportunities to both counter bias within AI and also potentially use AI to counter bias itself that might be either exported in the product or, for example, in makeups, like I've mentioned?
Thank you for that question, Sarah. So I think, yet again, that bias is a social problem that needs to be kind of attacked from all angles. And technology has a role, but it's not the only role. Within AI, there are different ways of addressing bias. There are technical approaches that have, for example, a lot to do with fairness and different notions of fairness and accountability. And we get into very technical ways of translating these social concepts into math. For example, how do you create fair ranking systems? I will say, though, that technical approaches alone will always be limited. They can sometimes even serve as a distraction from addressing the root cause of bias, which is essentially a racialized, gendered, age-based, sexuality-based, and so on discrimination that is part of our society, regardless of whether that is in the newsroom, in a corporation, in the school, in any other organization. What AI can do, and we hear that very often, is kind of show us that bias. But that's actually a little bit of a limited approach because that bias was always there and very often was flagged by those who were affected by it. But there are different ways in which AI can play a fundamental role in the newsroom, which I will get to talk about a little later. But that's to say that there is an importance of addressing this from all angles. And again, storytelling comes in here. We need to look at this through storytelling and actually have storytelling that opens the black box. The black box of AI is not just a technical black box.
That's really interesting. Professor Beckett, I'm wondering, in that context, what are you telling newsrooms these days? When they come to you, because I know they're coming to you, they're asking for advice, you're interfacing with many of them. What's on your checklist?
Well, I work with newsrooms all around the world, and we do kind of collaborative experimentation with them where they talk amongst themselves and work amongst themselves to meet some of the challenges. And the key thing for them is, how do you apply the technologies to that particular task around journalism? Journalism is, a particular kind of profession with particular editorial and ethical and economic demands. And what we can see is that there's a real diversity of these news organizations. You mentioned Bloomberg. Now, Bloomberg are pretty good at handling this. They've got a big R&D department. But what's been fascinating is working with some of the more smaller or more specialized newsrooms around the world, perhaps in markets where people, for example, don't speak English. And that's a huge challenge because a lot of the data and technology related to AI is English-based. So one of the transformational aspects might be using AI for translation, which could reduce boundaries and barriers for certain news organizations. So the feedback I get from them is that people are very curious about the technology. They're starting to adapt it, but there's a severe problem, which is basically there aren't enough people in the news industry who know about the tech. And as we all know, the news industry is not very wealthy at the moment. It doesn't have the kind of money that, pharmaceuticals or security industries have to develop this technology. So it's a mixed picture. There's a lot of excitement and a lot of innovation going on, but it's still a struggle, if you like, to sort of keep up.
So it's fair to say we need perhaps more awareness. And so perhaps we're contributing to that also a little bit today in having this conversation. Mona, I'd like to ask you, because you're not only focused, of course, on journalism and AI. Where we mentioned that we're talking about AI for good, where are you also seeing positive applications, more broadly speaking?
I'm so glad you asked that question. I'm particularly excited about any systems that have a very clearly defined task and a clearly defined context in which they operate, and very much so in the context of tackling the climate emergency. Just to give you a couple of examples, AI can help us optimize energy use and the management of the electronic grid. It can actually stop wind turbines when an endangered bird is approaching the turbine and stop it temporarily. It can help invasive species to be kept at bay, for example, at the Great Barrier Reef. It can help improve prediction of the climate development so we can make better policies and address the climate emergency faster. So as you can see, there's a ton of really interesting developments. There's one interesting development also that I'm currently working on at NYU with my colleague Hilke Schellman, who is a professor of journalism, where we are developing a new natural language processing tool for freedom of information requests, which will help under-resourced newsrooms to go through that faster.
That's really great, and I think a lot of journalists will be very grateful for you for developing that. In fact, that's never really a terribly fun process, I think for most people. But just tell us very, very briefly, Mona, inappropriate AI. What would that be? Or inappropriate uses of AI?
Well, that's a big question. I think we can say that any AI system that profoundly affects human life and makes decision about human life, for example, the use of AI systems in predictive policing or in law enforcement, are very problematic. We've seen very problematic applications of artificial intelligence very recently in the context of the pandemic in terms of proctoring, so overseeing students taking exams in their homes. These systems often are biased against certain populations. We know from the terrific work of Joy Buolamwini, Timnit Gebru, and Debraji that these biases are unevenly distributed across society. They affect primarily, when we're talking about computer vision systems, people with darker skin tones and women. So when we put that into the context of high-stakes social environments, then we have a problem.
Okay, and we're going to be talking about that problem. That's why I asked you about this in the next panel after this, where we're talking about AI and its potential uses in mass surveillance. So for our viewers, do stay with us for that. The conversation is continuing. But, in conclusion, I would just like to ask all of you here, what your hope is really for the future when we're talking about AI for good, when we're talking about it being used either in the context of journalism. What is a positive development that you are hoping for on the horizon? What's on your wish list? And I'll begin with Ling.
I still think that the issue of AI literacy is a key thing. More and more people, especially the ones that's historically less familiar with machines, should have more literacy in the machine. So creativity is really about intuition. I think journalism itself is really something that we always need sort of a human creativity and intuition. And machine is only a way to help. And never just think about machine as a way to automate.
Mona, your
we need
view.
To have more creative ways of use. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Ling. Mona, I want to just briefly hear from you. What's on your wish list?
On my wish list is that we talk about technology, society, and power in more concrete ways. Technology is power, and I really hope that in the sense of literacy, we all participate in that and can make that discourse a little bit more democratic, and I think journalism plays a central role here.
Professor Beckett, you have the last word. How are you looking into the future?
Well, I'm lucky. I can see the sort of future unfolding because I'm working with the news organisations who are at the cutting edge, and I can see some, very creative. I like what Ling said about unleashing creativity, as well as very functional uses of this. And the most exciting bit is when it's a combination of the human and the technology. So, for example, one team we work with who developed a tool to try and monitor and measure gender bias in a newsroom and its content. So I thought that was very innovative and very creative and a very positive way to try and harness this technology.
And on that, we conclude our panel, Looking into the Future, Technology to the Rescue. Thank you so much to our distinguished panelists